Hello, very beautiful community. You're going to be angry at me because when so much is flying off its hinges politically, you either want some sweets, maybe a tiramisu, or you want raw meat. And the algorithms want me to give you raw meat. But I'm going to give you lettuce. Sorry, I don't know what happened with my words there. It's just brain fog. I'm going to give you lettuce. Now, that means that we're going to chat about something that's grounding but not directly related to everything that's going on. I want to chat about disagreement, how you disagree with others in your life and how you disagree with others online. And of course, I want to say that there are two buckets here, inevitably, for us. I don't know what I'm going to say in this chat, but I do know that I'm going to have to say there are two buckets. There's political disagreement, about which we must think of in a special way. So let's say something about that second. And then there is disagreement outside politics. So let's say something about that first. Of course, in a banal, literal-minded sense, disagreement is just somebody saying A and then somebody else saying not A. But there is a richer, more meaningful, substantive sense of disagreement, where it's about B not simply rejecting or contradicting A, but adequately differentiating themselves from A. So let's give an example. Imagine you've got a Giacometti print that's signed that you've put up on your wall and it's the best thing you've ever owned. And a friend of yours comes in and says, I don't think it's very good, because even though you say it somehow advances figurative representation, in reality, I think judgments in art are just subjective. And so every print and painting and drawing and bit of sculpture is as good as every other. And moreover, you've put it up, but it actually fails the first criteria of a quality work of art, which is that it should match your couch. And so your friend's contradicting you there. Your friend's saying, no, that thing you've put up on the wall is not good, either as an object to put on the wall or as a painting. And you're saying that it is. But I don't think it's quite right in the richer substantive sense to say that your friend's disagreeing with you. Because disagreement means adequate differentiation. It doesn't just mean saying not A. And I've thought to chat with you about this because I've got into a weird habit, which is a little bit rude, but just slightly short of being too rude, which is that I often say to you, when you disagree with me, no, you don't. I found myself saying that 3 or 4 times in the last week, and that prompted me to do this chat. And the context in which I found myself saying it is that folks have claimed, Vlad, look, you're wrong about this idea that democracies are declining and that they're going to be more fragile in the 2030s, because the state of democracy simply depends on the mood of the people and how they're going to vote. And the problem with that position is it is absolutely a disagreement in that first sense of literal saying not A, but it's not a substantive disagreement, because the reason I say democracies are in decline is because there are certain social forces that we can't entirely control that are not just at hand, but are proliferating. And so to disagree with my position, you'd need to say either that these social forces are not there, or that I have misunderstood them, or that social forces do not matter. And here is some explicit argument about why that's the case. That position would perhaps be on the border of the literal-minded disagreement, which is just asserting not A, and a substantive disagreement where you take a different view. So in other words, to disagree with my view about democratic decline, you actually have to give an alternate account of social explanation kind about the various social and cultural and economic forces at work. You can't disagree with me unless you give an alternate account of these things. Unless you do that, you're simply asserting not A. You're in the position of the Giacometti denier. And it's very important that this leads to another question. And that other question is about what we might call peer-to-peer disagreement. in a very, very literal-minded sense, peer-to-peer disagreement doesn't exist. Because for every question about matters of a normative or evaluative kind, what's a better way to do something, or what is really going on, if Susan and Harry disagree, one of them is always going to be in a better position than the other, or almost always. In fact, I would say always. The disagreement between them is probably not going to be about Harry having more of something and Susan having less, or Susan having more of something and Harry having less. It's more likely to be a matter of Susan having a bit more of this, a bit less of that, and then again a bit more of this, and then a bit less of that, but a lot more of some other thing. And there being some equivalent balance on Harry's side. And so what you're going to have is different respects in which Susan and Harry are both worse and better than one another at making a judgment about a particular thing. And so if that in some literal-minded way removes peer-to-peer disagreement from the table, it's not going to remove a more relaxed and convenient sense of peer-to-peer disagreement, which just means, well, is it true that Harry and Susan are very, very, very roughly compatibly matched when it comes to their disagreement about something? That would mean that if they're disagreeing about a painting, that they both have vaguely, commensurate initiation into the world of the visual arts, that they vaguely have commensurate sort of cognitive and imaginative capacities, compatible capacities, and that it's not clear that Susan is completely out of Harry's league when they're talking about this, or that Harry is completely out of Susan's league. And that we could call peer-to-peer disagreement. But even on this more relaxed definition of peer-to-peer disagreement, there's a lot of disagreement that is simply not peer-to-peer at all. So, we have already seen an example of that with the Giacometti print. You have it on your wall because you've been to many Giacometti exhibitions, because you've read about Giacometti, because you can put Giacometti in context of 20th century art, and your friend doesn't know anything about that. Your friend's never been to an exhibition. So that's a classic example of a non-peer-to-peer disagreement. And that distinction is very useful. So we've put two distinctions on the table so far. One's between a literal-minded conception of disagreement and a conception of disagreement as meaningful differentiation. And the second distinction we've put on the table is the distinction between peer-to-peer and non-peer-to-peer disagreement. Why is this important? It's important because our culture, perhaps because of several reasons, one of which being that we are a scientistic culture, overly focuses on the particular claim somebody is making against somebody else that are then contradicted by the somebody else with particular other claims, instead of focusing on process rather than result. At the level of process, how well placed are the two parties to disagree with one another? And a conclusion follows here for you, namely that it's wrong to get worked up about, now that's a bit overly strong because you've got to have your personal relationship with how you deal with things like that, with non-peer-to-peer disagreement where you are in the superior position, right? Don't get worked up by the person who says it's all about the couch. But also, watch out for it the other way around. So, imagine that somebody with 44 NAFO hashtags in their account goes after some kind of Russia country expert and says, look, 90% of Russians fully support Putin's war. Because if that weren't the case, that'd be a revolution. And the Russia expert is sort of triggered by that and says, well, that's not just a misunderstanding of Russian society, it's a misunderstanding of how depoliticization works, it's a misunderstanding of how a certain kind of consolidation occurs when countries engage in foreign aggression. It's a misunderstanding of political life under authoritarian regimes. It's a misunderstanding of the difference between the concept of blame and responsibility without blame. Right? So it's a non-peer-to-peer disagreement. In other words, the person making the claim against a Russia country expert hasn't understood how sociological explanation works, hasn't understood how authoritarian regimes function, hasn't understood the global forces at hand, hasn't understood what's wrong and not wrong with Russian culture and so on. And so it's very important that you don't, if you like, abuse yourself and behave in a self-destructive way where you are equalizing yourself with a position that's far superior to yours. And the problem with that isn't that you're going to be rude to somebody. It's not illegal. The problem with that is going to stifle your development. Right? If it advanced your development, I'd say, for goodness sake, you can go ahead and be rude as long as you're not too rude. You can say whatever the hell you want about Russia or whatever other part of the world. But it's going to stifle your development because you're going to relate as though certain challenges that you still need to traverse aren't there for you because you've either traversed them or you don't need to traverse them because you don't believe they exist. But they exist. So this kind of false equalization of yourself really, really harms your sense of your development and your sense of your development. And one of the reasons it feels so damaging to one when one does that, even though one's inclined to deny the damage, is that it obstructs growth. And humans that don't grow feel terrible about themselves. They really do. If you're not better in some way 1 month later, than you were a month earlier, if you're not better in anywhere, anything, a month on, and a year on, and 5 years on, it's not going to feel good to anybody. It's just not going to feel good. It feels pretty crappy. And it feels crappy in particular in relation to a very big event that occurs at the end of your life. Because it's very important that you approach that event with the thought, it's okay if this event now happens. Because a lot of things have gone nicely in my life. That might not be available to you because you've suffered various contingencies and misfortunes. But if you haven't, that's the aspiration, to say, enough good things have happened to me across time that now, if this happened, it would be okay. It would be not untimely. So this reversal is really important because in the modern world, we overwhelmingly focus, and in many ways rightly, on how when we misbehave a little bit, that hurts the person toward whom we're misbehaving. But in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, there was much more of an emphasis on how not behaving very nicely hurts you. That's partly why, for classical philosophers, it's essentially impossible to resuscitate a concept of human rights from the ancient world, even though arguably there are partial intimations of it, for instance, in the writings of Aristotle. And it's difficult because for us, the concept is such that it's all about the protection of a political party or a particular party against the excesses of somebody's inappropriate conduct, which needs to be ceased so that the party is not harmed. We don't think of protecting someone's human rights in terms of protecting the flourishment of the person who might do the bad thing. but that was an emphasis that was enormously more culturally available to the ancients than it is to us. And one very useful way of engaging with distant cultures is to say that we can learn something from them if they have in a much more intense form something present, you know, which we could borrow without being able to borrow it with all of that intensity, but which we could borrow on a lesser power. So it teaches us how to have a little bit of something we're missing when we look at the presence of that thing in a very intense form in some distant culture. So all of that is still elaboration on this second concept, on the two concepts, right? The disagreement has to be about adequate differentiation, and the disagreement has to be flexible and dance-like and conscious around this business of whether it's peer-to-peer or not peer-to-peer. And the way we punish ourselves by being blind and riding roughshod over distinctions about peer-to-peer and non-peer-to-peer disagreement is that it obstructs our growth. Let me make one little further remark about disagreement, because I think there's a third virtue I want to mention on top of understanding adequate disagreement and on top of understanding the peer-to-peer distinction. And that's the virtue of being able to judge the truth value or the depth of things you don't understand. I do think there is such a virtue, and it can be cultivated. There are people who had an amazing capacity for gauging the depth of something they don't understand and don't even need to understand, such that if it's deep, they're not going to say it's superficial, and if it's superficial, they're not going to say it's deep. It's a wonderful capacity to sort of, if you like, operate with some epistemic friction outside the realm of what you're perhaps qualified to make a judgment about. One example in these waters is, for instance, having good philosophical instincts without being a philosopher. Just give you an example. The public intellectual Clive James had really wonderful philosophical instincts without himself being or wanting to be or needing to be a philosopher. And the reason that's so important is because on so many questions that really matter, we necessarily have to operate in the realm where we're partly inside some space where we're qualified to judge and partly not. We're partly always riskily, precariously reaching outside. So we can sometimes do something about that and get to know something more deeply. I mean, let's take a personal example, because we're speaking casually with each other. For me, it's psychoanalysis. I want to have a deeper understanding of psychoanalytic understanding than I do. And I am constructively jealous, constructively envious, because some feelings of envy are playful and also conducive to growth, and others are corrosive, which are like, he has that and I don't. And, I wish I did too. But I'm sort of delightfully envious of my great hero Richard Wolheim for his extraordinary depth of psychoanalytic understanding, which is growing for me, but is still delimited. But there are some areas where you're never going to get it right. Some areas where it wouldn't even be right for you to invest energy in deepening your understanding. But still, it might be true that you're a bit reliant on assumptions in that field to make a particular judgment you need to make. And so therefore, this virtue of sensing the truth value and the depth of domains that aren't entirely yours is itself a habit, is itself a skill. Okay, enough. Now politics. Everything I've just discussed is a matter of intellectual disagreement. It might be factual disagreement, it might be interpretive disagreement, it might be normative disagreement. Factual is roughly, is it raining today? Interpretive is roughly, is Keir Starmer a competent leader? Normative is what's a bad thing to do, ethically, politically, and so on. The problem in politics is that we regularly reduce political conflict to intellectual disagreement, and it isn't intellectual disagreement. Political disagreement is not like me sitting in a philosophy seminar, which I don't do anymore for health reasons, and saying, excuse me, colleague X, I think we have opposite positions here, and one of us is right and the other one is wrong. Because what's going on there is that we are engaged in a particular ritual where we're both aiming to try, hopefully, to get things right. But that's not a good analogy for political conflict. An analogy for political conflict is if you and I have gone out to dinner and we're trying to decide what food to order and what wine to have. In that context, an intellectual objection to what you want isn't going to settle things, because we're not engaged in intellectual conflict only. We're engaged in conflict that is about the negotiation of shared space. So I might say to you, don't order this bottle of Burgundy because it's going to not be ready. It's going to shut down 10 minutes after you open it. And it's going to be, a sort of a closed skeletal version of itself. But you might say, I still want it. I can then go on trying to say, well, can I challenge you in a way that's more on your terms? Because maybe you don't even want to have a wine that shows well. Maybe you just had a dream about having a particular Burgundy and you're committed to having it there and then. And even if it's closed and it's a sort of you're drinking potential rather than reality in the bottle, it's still going to be worth it for you. And so I could then say, okay, I get that, but even if I understand your purposes correctly, I still don't think that's a great option, because you can do everything you do with that choice with another choice that's going to be just as good, but better in other respects. It's going to be more open, let's say, and more ready to drink. So I've sort of repositioned myself to understand your claim more on your terms, but it still might not be enough, because you don't need to give me a rational explanation about just wanting something. You might just still say, I want it. You might even add, do you know what? I don't even know why I want it. I just feel that I want it. Well, what do you say to that? You've clearly transcended the space of mere sort of intellectual disagreement about aesthetic judgment, or disagreement about how to fulfill a particular wish, the understanding of which you coherently share. You're now in the realm of somebody wanting something and you not necessarily even understanding why they want it. They perhaps not even necessarily understanding why they want it, but they want it, and you have to make a practical decision about what is jointly going to happen in your space. You have to say, okay, I'm with you, we're going to order this, or you say, no, I really think we should rethink this, or you say, you have that Burgundy, and I'm going to get myself a bottle of something else. We'll drink from separate bottles. So it's very important that no matter how hard you try, there is no ideal resolution to this conflict that finally reduces it to intellectual disagreement. It's always going to be about the negotiation of shared space, which is going to be uncapturable by a mere postulation of intellectual disagreement. And then there are less lovely scenarios, right? If the person who wants this particular bottle that's not going to show well is challenged too strongly, they might get grumpy. and they might throw a glass of wine across the table at their friend who's not accommodating their wish. Then you're going to have another choice. Do we try to patch this up? Do we leave? Are we going to get kicked out? You see, this is a completely different domain to the domain of intellectual disagreement. It's possible with intellectual disagreement to say, you've thought deeply about this, you've thought honestly about this, you've thought responsibly about this, but I easily dismiss what you say because it's plainly clear that you are mistaken. I can't say that in the dinner table equivalent, in the dinner table situation, because it's not an intellectual disagreement, it's a negotiation of space. And that's not because your dinner partner just has a lazy relationship with truth and is trying to, order a bottle of wine on the basis of untruthful considerations. It's because truth is only one consideration among others, and we regularly underestimate how far it'll necessarily be pushed out of the way when what's happening is a shared negotiation of space. And it's tyrannical to think that you can resolve conflicts that arise there by ever more refined application of the notion of intellectual disagreement. It's not just because, as I say, your dinner partner has a relatively impoverished relationship with truth to you, which may not even be the case. It's also because the choice isn't what is a better bottle of wine in the abstract. It's what do I, as an embodied agent, negotiating the world with particular feelings, with particular desires, with particular frustrations, with particular wants, with particular dreams, feel like practically grabbing, doing, touching next in the world. Right? So it's a practical, embodied negotiation of a reality in which you're constantly making decisions between different scenarios in front of you. That's not the same question as which bottle of wine is better in the abstract. So it's not just that if your partner indeed has a sloppy relationship with truth, you can't do much about it because you're still sharing space with them. It's also that it would be a very serious conceptual mistake to imagine the ordering wine in a restaurant scenario as being reducible to some kind of abstract conversation about what's a better bottle of wine. I mean, somebody could want to drink a worse bottle of wine on the day. So don't make the mistake about political disagreement, which reduces it to intellectual disagreement. It isn't that. And the desire to reduce disagreement with your political opponents to intellectual disagreement leads you to do this, to pretend that your political opponents don't exist because you have wished them away and in your mind substituted them for what you consider to be more rational and more adequate versions of them. But the real versions of them are still out there and they're acting while you're fantasizing. And they're probably winning against you politically while you're evading the reality around you. Right? You are losing efficacy as a citizen in your capacity to engage in conflict constructively if you reduce political disagreement to intellectual disagreement. So this was probably lettuce with some vitamin C and vitamin B12 injections on top. Not a lovely thing to receive. But if you have managed to receive it, I'm very grateful. Lots of love and talk very soon.